Hello everyone, welcome to Chetan Bharat Learning and welcome back to this lecture series of UPSC Mains 2021 course and test series. Well, this course is for those people who have qualified their prelims examination and are appearing for their Mains 2021 examination. And for others who weren't able to qualify for prelims examination, well, if you're serious about next year's attempt, then you should also join this course because you will be able to complete your mains preparation beforehand. Alright, so this course is relevant for all UPSC aspirants, those who are appearing for this year's mains and those who are appearing for next year's prelims as well as mains. We should be hopeful, right? So yeah, now this is lecture number 5. As you guys all know, we have shared this timetable with you. Those of you who have joined this course, well, they have this timetable now. Now, till now, as far as GS3 is concerned and economics is concerned, we have completed 4 lectures. Today is economy lecture number 5. And in this lecture, we will cover certain economy related issues through questions. And as you guys all know by now, that every class contains 5 questions. And through those 5 questions, we try to cover as many issues as possible that are relevant for your mains examination. Now today we are going to discuss 5 topics from this part of your syllabus. It's actually 3. From this part of your syllabus, government budgeting. Alright? If you are familiar with the syllabus mentioned in General Studies 3 paper, then you know that this is the topic that you need to cover. Alright? It's this exact precise name is mentioned. These precise words are mentioned in your GS3 main syllabus. Well, let me clear this beforehand. Government budgeting also includes fiscal policy. As you guys all know, that monetary policy is the domain of RBI, whereas fiscal policy is the domain of government. And government comes out with its fiscal policy through budget every year. So government budgeting, this topic of government budgeting in your syllabus also includes fiscal policy. So it would include questions related to taxation, it would include questions related to fiscal deficit, fiscal stimulus, and all that stuff. Alright, so without further ado, without further delay, let's start with our question answer discussion. Alright, so first question is the following. Highlighting the recent reforms taken by the government in the context of tax administration in India suggests some measures in the context. Now, as I've told you before, that in these lectures, we shall study or we shall learn how to read questions properly, how to interpret the questions properly, because half the battle is won if you read the question properly. Because if you don't read the question properly, you won't be able to answer it correctly, right? So let's read this question properly. Highlighting the recent reforms taken by the government in the context of tax administration in India suggests some measures in the context. Now, this question is asking you, actually asking you 2 things. One, what were the recent taxation related reforms undertaken by the government? That's why they have written highlighting recent reforms taken by the government. So you need to highlight, so you need to mention in your answer what were the recent taxation reforms taken by the government. Alright, and then the second part of your question would be suggest some measures in this context, which means that after mentioning those taxation reforms, you need to also give your views on how to improve tax administration in India. What other things the government of India can do, right? So again, we'll divide this question into 2 parts. Now, part 1 includes mentioning the taxation reforms. Now, as this question is, the language of this question suggests that you need to write some introduction for this answer, right? This question requires some introduction. So in the introduction part, you'll write 2 or 3 lines. That improving tax administration in India is very important because it will ease the life of taxpayers as well as generate more revenue for the government. And government can use that revenue for welfare expenditure, right? So improving tax administration is extremely important. That should be your introduction, just 2 or 3 lines. Okay, why tax administration is important? Well, number 1, it improves the lives of taxpayers. Number 2, it increases the revenue of the government through which it performs its functions. Make sense? Now, after giving that introduction, then you will move to Then you'll start mentioning the recent reforms taken by the government. Now, to give a better structure to your answer, you'll write that government has taken various reforms to improve the tax administration in India. Now, the reforms undertaken by the government to improve tax administration can be divided into two parts. Part 1 would be direct tax reforms. Direct tax reforms. Government has taken various direct tax reforms, and the other part is indirect tax reforms, which includes GS3 and all. Right? So in the beginning, you'll divide your answer into two parts, highlighting government's measures, highlighting the measures taken by government to improve tax administration. Well, in that highlighting part, you'll divide your answer into two parts: direct tax reforms, indirect tax reforms. All right. Now you'll get your model answers. This lecture also, there is a PDF attached to this lecture, and you'll get your model answers. In those model answers, you will find in detail the direct tax reforms, the indirect tax reforms. But I'm not concerned with that over here. I'm not concerned with the data points. I'm actually concerned with how you should approach the question. So right at the outset, you should form a structure. Your answer should have a good structure. And this is a way to give structure to your answer. Divide the reforms into two parts. Now, let me give you an example of direct tax reforms. So one of the biggest direct tax reform that Government of India undertook was this. Transparent taxation. Let me clear the screen again. So for direct tax, government enacted this. Transparent taxation, honoring the honest platform. Transparent taxation, honoring the honest platform. All right. This particular reform can be further subdivided into three parts. This particular reform includes faceless assessment scheme, then you'll write some lines about faceless assessment scheme, then faceless appeal scheme, and the third part would be taxpayers charter. You write a few lines about each and every component. Okay. Now, this is a set of direct tax reforms that have been undertaken. There are other direct tax reforms that you'll get in your model answers. Now, after writing about direct taxes, then you'll write about indirect taxes. So indirect taxes includes indirect tax reforms, rationalizing tax rates, in GST Council. Then government has also tried to improve the custom regulations through various platforms, ICE Gate, and various other reforms. Again, you will find many of those reforms in the model answer. Okay, so you'll structure your answer by mentioning first the direct tax reforms, then the indirect tax reforms. Then comes the second part of your question. Suggest some measures in this context. Now, what should be other things that the government can do? Well, government needs to further simplify taxation related laws so that tax base would increase, and which will eventually lead to increase in government's tax revenue. Right? So to improve tax revenue, to improve tax buoyancy, you need to improve your tax base as well. And how will you improve your tax base? By further simplifying taxation laws. Then this is number one. Then the other measure that you can talk about is government should completely eliminate retrospective taxation. Retrospective taxation has caused a lot of misery to India's image in the outside world. So retrospective taxation. Then government should use technology to usher in use of technology like artificial intelligence, machine learning, big data, all these new technologies to improve efficiency of the taxation system, plus enhance transparency and accountability. Transparency and accountability in the tax administration. So you'll suggest 3 reform measures. There are 3 measures. Number one is further simplification of taxation laws. This is number one, so that tax base would increase and hence tax buoyancy or tax revenues would increase. Number 2 is elimination of retrospective taxation. And number 3 would be use of technology to enhance transparency and accountability in the tax administration, so that the taxpayer gets this feeling of being a partner in nation building. Generally, taxpayers are victimized by the tax departments, income tax department in particular. But taxpayers shouldn't be victimized. There shouldn't be any avenue for tax terrorism in India, right? So we need to instill confidence in the taxpayer and we need to make them believe that they are partners in nation building, because it is after all their money that the government uses for India's development, right? So they should be treated as partners in nation building. Now, this is also your conclusion, okay? So this is how you will approach this question. This is question number 1. All right? Now, let's move on to question number 2. Government's fiscal response was adapting to various phases of pandemic of COVID-19. Illustrate. Also enumerate the measures taken by the central government to support state government in this pandemic time. Well, again, this question is divided into 2 parts. They're asking you 2 things. 1, what was the fiscal response? How did government responded fiscally to this situation? What was government's fiscal stimulus package? What did the government do? Right? So how did the government respond to this challenge? And what did the government do to save the economy from this brutal challenge? Now, let's answer the first part. To answer the first part, you need to understand a few things. You see, we have talked about this in the previous lecture as well. You see, whenever there is recession, government comes out with a fiscal stimulus package. Now, why does the government come out with fiscal stimulus? By the way, fiscal stimulus means pushing money into the economy. Government reduces its tax rates and increases its expenditure. Sometimes governments hands out money to the people. It directly puts money in the bank accounts of people. Again, the idea of fiscal stimulus is to improve aggregate demand. Because during recessions, demand levels are down, and when demand levels are down, well, the economy cannot bounce back. So fiscal stimulus is given to improve aggregate demand levels, and when aggregate demand levels improve, well, the economy starts to recover. Now, the other countries, especially the developed countries, started with their massive fiscal stimulus programs to save their economies from the pandemic. Right? Because they also enforced lockdowns. There were also lockdowns in USA, UK, everywhere in Europe. Now, lockdowns do have a bad impact on the economy, right? So to save the economy from these lockdowns, almost all the governments came out with a fiscal stimulus package. They pumped money into the economy, right? USA did that, UK did that. Now, what did they do? All the other economies front-loaded, or all the other economies offloaded their entire fiscal stimulus in one go. They gave money to the people in one go. They started spending heavily from the very beginning. But what did India do? India did things a little differently. India provided this fiscal stimulus in 2 phases. Phase 1 and phase 2. Now, phase 1 included spending. In phase 1, government knew that their fiscal stimulus won't improve demand levels. Now, how does that happen? Why did government give this logic? Well, government said that if we start spending heavily today, in the beginning itself, then it won't have any impact on aggregate demand levels, number 1. And that would amount to wastage of resources, wastage of precious fiscal resources that we could have used in phase 2. So in the beginning of the pandemic, government said that we are going to utilize our resources efficiently. In the beginning, we won't spend that much. Our stimulus package won't be of a big amount. We would spend cautiously. So we would spend only little amount. And that too, we will spend on essential items like food, medicine, masks, right? Then ventilators, hospitals. So government said that initially in the phase 1, we would spend only on essential items. We would not spend that much. We would not spend that much, and we would not actually give money to the people because it won't increase aggregate demand levels. Now, why did government give this logic? Why did government think that increasing fiscal stimulus in the beginning itself won't have any impact on aggregate demand? Well, government gave 2 reasons for that. Number 1, had government given money to the people directly in their bank account, had government done that, well, people wouldn't have had any avenues to manifest their demands. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let's suppose government has given 10,000 rupees to everyone. Now, government is doing that so that people get this 10,000 rupees and they go out for shopping, right? They spend that money. By spending that money, they would increase demand levels. But government knew that today, at this moment, and at that moment, the situation was that of a lockdown. Even if people get that money, well, they won't have any avenues to spend it on. Malls are closed, hotels are closed, tourism is closed, everything is closed. So even if you give money to people, they won't be able to spend it because there is lockdown. And because they won't be able to spend it, well, aggregate demand levels won't increase. Makes sense, right? So government knew that there is a lockdown, and therefore giving people money now won't have any impact on aggregate demand levels. As a matter of fact, what you should do is just use, because you have limited money, government also has limited money, so use that money for providing essential items and enforce certain or bring in certain reforms and bring in certain other things to save the industry. So government came out with various schemes also. ECLGS scheme, Emergency Credit Line Guarantee Scheme. The scheme was to protect the micro, small and medium enterprises because they were also essential, right? So to protect micro, small and medium enterprises, government came out with ECLGS scheme. You'll find this entire thing in your model answers, don't worry. So there was ECLGS scheme, then the biggest food subsidy, biggest food rationing program in the world was conducted by the government of India. It came out with Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana, right? For all those migrant laborers that were traveling on foot back to their villages. Clear? So in the phase 1, government preserved its fiscal resources and spent it, and they were spending it judiciously on essential items. Again, because of this reason, because there was lockdown, there was not, people could not have spent their money anywhere, right? Achha, the other reason for not offloading fiscal stimulus in the beginning was during times of crisis, whenever there is economic crisis, people don't spend, they actually save because they are scared. Whenever there is an economic crisis, the motive to save increases. People start saving more. So precautionary motive to save. Because you're taking all precautions. You don't know where this economy would go. So you're saving money so that in future, in emergency situations, you are not short of funds. So precautionary motive to save was high during the lockdown. Right? So government thought that because of these 2 reasons, fiscal stimulus won't increase aggregate demand. Hence, we will spend only on essential items. Now in phase 2, once the unlocking started, then government offloaded its demand-centric fiscal stimulus package. Government increased its infrastructure spending, capex. Right? Government gave various gifts and various monetary benefits, fiscal benefits to government employees and all that stuff. Right? So government followed a calibrated approach. taking a different strategy. Government followed a different approach, different from the developed world, right? So this was the entire approach. Now, what sort of words you should use to describe this entire thing, what I just have described? Well, you'll have to consult the model answers, all right? So this part of your answer is complete. Now, also enumerate the measures taken by the central government to support state government in this pandemic time. Well, this part of the question is again fairly direct. You just have to mention various steps taken by government to support financially the state governments. So some of those steps were, well, government increased the borrowing limits of states by 1%. But this was conditional. Only those states were allowed to borrow more. Only states that conducted certain reforms were allowed to borrow additional 1%. Well, some of those reforms were one nation, one ration card reform, right? Ease of doing business reforms. So those states that conducted those reforms, government enhanced their borrowing limit, right? Then government provided certain grants to states. Then government also gave certain compensation to states, right? So various steps were taken by central government to support the states. Again, this portion requires a lot of cramming and it doesn't require any conceptual understanding. Therefore, I'm not discussing it in the class. You'll just get it in your model answers. All right? Make sense? Okay. Now we'll move to the third part of the question. This is again a fairly easy question. Again, we won't spend that much time on it because it's a direct question. It involves cramming certain items, right? And you should cram these items because, again, a question related to gender budgeting can come in your mains examination. So whatever model answer we are going to provide you with this question, just remember it, study it properly. Again, chalo, let's discuss this question a bit. Discuss the concept of gender budgeting and analyze its significance in Indian context. Well, it's a fairly simple question. First of all, you need to explain in your answer what is gender budgeting. Well, every year government comes out with a budget, right? But if that budget has a gender-based orientation, well, it's an example of gender budgeting. Well, what do I mean by gender-based orientation? Well, if government comes out with schemes or monetary outlay for women, if government comes out with women-specific schemes, women-specific funds, women-specific grants in their budget, then it's an example of gender-based budgeting. Then, in case the schemes are for all, in case the schemes are for everyone, men and women, then even in those schemes, if the government mentions that 30% of the funds shall be utilized exclusively for women, 40% of the funds shall be utilized exclusively for women, then they are actually conducting an exercise called gender-based budgeting. So your budget should have a gendered orientation, right? It should have schemes for women. It should have, and even those schemes that are for everyone, even in those schemes, there should be certain financial outlay for women only, right? Plus, whenever you are coming out with schemes, you also have certain targets also. For example, government is giving 1,000 crores to Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan. Now, whenever government is giving 1,000 crores to Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan in their budget, they also mention the targets they are trying to achieve from these 1,000 crore rupees, right? So in those targets also, there are targets that are specific to women only. If that is the case, then you are doing gender budgeting. Now, first part of the question, which involves the definition of gender budgeting, is over. Now, the second part is analyze its significance in Indian context. Well, it's a very general answer. You see, why gender-based budgeting is important in India? Well, very simple. As far as women are concerned, they considerably lag behind men in various social indicators and as well as in various economic indicators. And that is why, to solve this problem, to bridge the gap between men and women, you need to come up with various social schemes, economic schemes, so that you can empower the other gender. You can empower women. Right? So for economic empowerment of women, you come out with certain schemes, you come out with certain financial outlays. For social empowerment of women, you come out with certain schemes, you come out with certain financial outlays. And for political empowerment, you come out with certain policies. Right? Now, you in this part of the question, you will mention how women lag behind men in certain indicators. So for example, as far as labor force participation rate is concerned, women are considerably behind men. As far as income or wealth levels are concerned, women are considerably behind men. As far as economic empowerment is concerned, women are considerably behind men. You'll mention all these things. You'll mention all those areas where women are behind men. And then in the end, you'll write that it is because of these reasons that we need gender-based budgeting. So in the second part of your question, you'll first mention the areas where women are behind. So for example, in higher education, the men outnumber women. In universities, men outnumber women, right? So there are various areas in which women are behind men. So to bridge the gap between men and women, you need gender-based budgeting. That's how you'll approach the answer. For any doubts, consult the model answer that we are going to provide you with this lecture. All right. So it's a fairly easy question. I won't delve deeper into this question. It's a fairly easy question. So we won't spend that much time on it. All right. Chalo. Now let's move on to question number 4. Now you see this question is hitting on the fundamental debate within the economic policy circles. Well, there is a set of economists who believe that excessive fiscal spending is bad for the economy. But there is another set of economists who believe that fiscal spending is okay as long as it is driving growth. Now, to understand this debate, and to answer this question properly, you need to be familiar with a certain concept. Well, let's discuss that concept first. Well, as you guys all know this by now, that GDP growth depends on 4 factors. There are 4 drivers of GDP growth. One is consumption. If there is higher levels of consumer spending, GDP growth increases. Then the other is investment. If there is higher spending for capital goods, that is, if there is higher investment related spending, well, that drives up GDP growth. Then there is government expenditure. If government expenditure on goods and services increases, well, then that also drives up GDP growth. And last is net exports. Net exports means, well, X over here means exports, M over here means imports. So net exports is exports minus imports. So if your exports are high, if you're exporting more than you are importing, then that also drives up GDP growth. Now what happens? Generally what happens? Whenever there is a recession, like there was a recession like a couple of months back, a COVID-19 induced recession, whenever there is a recession, well, consumer spending is down. Of course, whenever there is a recession, people are not spending that much money. So consumer spending is down. Whenever there is a recession, private investment also drops down. Whenever there is a recession, and a recession like COVID-19, then in that case, well, exports are also driven down. Generally, whenever there is a recession, consumer spending is down, investment spending is down, net exports are down. Now, the only savior for your GDP growth that is left is government spending. Now, whenever there is a recession, it is always advised that government should increase its fiscal spending. Government should increase its expenditure, because only through that, government is going to compensate for decline in consumption expenditure, investment expenditure, export expenditure. Right? And to save the economy, whenever all 3 of them are down, to save the economy, government needs to increase its expenditure. Now, whenever government increases its expenditure, well, its fiscal deficit rises. And what is fiscal deficit? Well, it's the difference between government expenditure and government revenue. Make sense? And this is known as fiscal stimulus or fiscal expansion. So during times of recession, it is advised that government should follow this policy of fiscal expansion, because government is the only driver that is left to save the economy, right? So whenever there is a recession, government is advised for fiscal expansion. Because why? Why government is advised for fiscal expansion? Because when government expands fiscally, it increases aggregate demand levels. Economy starts to recover because demand levels are high. Economy starts to recover, then investors, private investors also gain some confidence, and therefore investment spending also starts to increase. This is known as crowding in of private investment. So when government is spending more and aggregate demand levels are rising, well, private investors are also encouraged to invest, right? So private investment also increases. This further increases demand, aggregate demand. And when aggregate demand is high, well, people's income also rises. And when people's income levels are rising, well, then their consumer spending also rises. So you see how through fiscal expansion, government saves an economy from a recession and GDP growth starts to rise. Make sense? All right. But this fiscal expansion comes at a cost. What is that cost? Well, they say that high fiscal expansion creates a situation of debt unsustainability for the government. Now, what does that mean? Higher fiscal deficit means that government should spend way more than it receives as revenue. Government spending should be more than its revenue. Now, how would government bridge this gap? If government is spending 100 rupees and government is only earning 60 rupees, then where does the government get this 40 rupees from to spend? Well, government borrows. So fiscal deficit is financed through borrowings. So whenever you expand fiscally, your borrowings increase. Now, if you expand fiscally beyond a certain threshold, if you increase your fiscal deficit to unsustainable limits, then you are increasing your debt to unsustainable limits, beyond unsustainable limits, right? And your debt sustainability is put into question. And that is why this set of economists who say that government should never expand fiscally, government should focus more on debt sustainability, well, they stand vindicated. So that is the debate, right? Some people, there is one set of economists who say that fiscal spending to drive growth is important. There is this another set of economists who say fiscal austerity. Fiscal austerity means reducing fiscal deficit. Fiscal austerity to manage overall debt is important, right? And these people are constantly debating. Some good economists believe in this first theory. Some very good economists also believe in this second theory. And there is this constant debate between the two. Now, who is right? Who is wrong? Well, what should we do? Now, generally, people say that there is a middle ground between these two extreme positions. One extreme position is expand fiscally. One extreme position is don't expand fiscally, reduce fiscal deficit. There is a middle ground between the two. What is that middle ground? Well, that middle ground is counter-cyclical fiscal policy. Now, what is that counter-cyclical fiscal policy? Counter-cyclical fiscal policy says that whenever there is a recession, government should expand fiscally. Fiscal expansion should be the norm whenever there is a recession. So expand fiscally, fiscal spending to drive growth should only be employed during times of recession or during times of downturn, when the economy is going through a crisis, right? During normal times or during times of economic boom, government should follow fiscal austerity. Fiscal austerity means government should reduce its fiscal deficit. And how will government reduce its fiscal deficit? By increasing tax revenue and reducing its expenditure. So through that, government would reduce its fiscal deficit. So people say, economists say, that this is the middle ground that we should follow. If we follow this middle ground religiously, properly, then your debt would never become unsustainable. Why? Because during times of recession, you're expanding fiscally. And when your economy recovers, you come back to fiscal austerity so as to reduce your debt. Make sense? So only use fiscal expansion when there is a requirement of it during times of downturn, economic downturn. This is what counter-cyclical fiscal policy is. So counter-cyclical fiscal policy is actually the middle ground between these two extremes. All right? And yeah, but one more thing. We have discussed about this. We have discussed about interest rate growth differential. Many supporters of this philosophy, fiscal spending to drive growth, they believe that if your fiscal expenditure is proper, if you're implementing your fiscal stimulus properly, then your growth rate would increase. And if your growth rate is more than the interest rate at which you have borrowed, then your debt automatically becomes sustainable. So for example, to improve your economy, you borrowed heavily, but you borrowed at 5% interest rate. And by spending that money that you have borrowed, you have achieved a growth rate of 10%. So if your economy is growing at the rate of 10%, then people's incomes are also rising at the rate of 10%, right? So tax revenues would increase. So GST revenues would increase. If your economy is growing so rapidly, then GST revenues, tax revenues would also increase. And when tax revenues would increase, this debt, this money that you have borrowed would become sustainable. You will be able to pay back this money. Because now you have money, your money has also increased, your revenues have also increased. So many economists, especially those who have written this year's economic survey, they say as long as your growth rate is more than the interest rate at which you have borrowed, high fiscal spending would not make your debt unsustainable. But we have discussed about IRGD. But in this question, they ask you how counter-cyclical fiscal policy helps in this regard. Well, counter-cyclical fiscal policy is the middle ground, right? So whenever there is a recession, expand fiscally. Whenever there is a boom or normal times, then contract fiscally. Only then you'll be able to keep your debt sustainable, right? So that is what is being asked in this question. Make sense? All right. Let's move on to the last part of this lecture, which is what is Ricardian equivalence proposition? Because this concept was mentioned in this year's economic survey. So there is every chance that UPSC might ask a question about this in your mains. All right. So what is Ricardian equivalence proposition? Comment on its relevance in Indian context. Now, what is Ricardian equivalence proposition? Hear me out carefully. You know, people who are against fiscal expansion, what is their argument? What do they say? They say that if you increase your fiscal deficit now to promote growth, if you're increasing your fiscal deficit now to promote growth, your debt levels would increase. Right? When your debt levels would increase, after X years, you'll have to pay back this debt. Right? Today, let's suppose it's 2021. You have borrowed so much so as to improve your economy. Okay. But in 2030, you'll have to pay back that debt. Right? So after 9 years or X years, you'll have to eventually pay back that debt. Now, how will you pay back that debt? Well, to pay back, you'll have to increase your revenue. You'll have to increase taxes on people. Don't you think? Now, when you'll increase taxes on people, well, what will happen? Well, when you'll increase taxes on people, their discretionary income would decrease. Don't you think so? So, for example, I earn 100 rupees every day, but now government is taking 30 rupees away from me in the form of taxes. Now, I am left with only 70 rupees to spend. So, if government increases taxes, don't you think demand levels would fall down because people would have less money to spend it on goods and services, right? So, in future, government will eventually have to increase taxes to pay off this debt. And when government will do that, then aggregate demand levels would fall down. So people who are against fiscal expansion, they say that this is a wrong thing to do because you're doing it at the expense of future generation. You're actually improving your economy now at the expense of future generations. Because now future generations' economy would be down just because you decided to save your economy over here. Right? Does that make any sense? So it is against the future generation also. Now, There was this guy called David Ricardo. He actually said that this is not true. David Ricardo said that it doesn't matter. Today you have to increase your expenditure. Let's suppose today you have to increase your expenditure. You can either increase your expenditure by taxing the people more, by increasing your tax rates. By that you'll get more money and then you'll be able to finance your expenditure. So you can either increase your expenditure by taxing people more, or you can increase your expenditure by borrowing. David Ricardo says that it won't have any impact on the future generation. Plus, it won't have any impact on the current generation as well. What does David Ricardo say? David Ricardo says that let's suppose you decided to finance your expenditure by taxing more. When you tax people more, they'll have less money to spend it on, right? They'll have less money to spend it on. And yes, your economy would be similarly placed. But you think that you can't reduce aggregate demand. You can't actually give people less money to spend on. So you think that we won't increase tax revenue. We would increase our borrowings. Now, when you increase your borrowings, you're thinking that people now have more money to spend on. Why? Because you haven't increased taxes. You have financed your expenditure through borrowings and you have kept taxes low. So now you're assuming that people would have more money to spend it on. But people are not stupid. That's what David Ricardo says. David Ricardo says that people won't increase their spending just because you haven't taxed them more and financed your expenditure through borrowings. People won't spend that money. Why? Because people are not stupid. People know that eventually government that is borrowing money will eventually have to pay back that debt, right? People know this, that now though government has kept the tax rates low, but in future to pay off this debt, government will eventually increase tax rates. Now in future, if the government would increase tax rates, then they will have less money to spend on. So what do these people do? To cater to this situation, to prepare for this situation, people start to save more. People start to save more. Why do they save? Because they know that in future tax rates would be increased and they would have less money. So they start saving today so that they have money even when tax rates are high in the future. So that they have enough funds with them even when tax rates are high in the future. So they start to save more. So there is no impact on future. Even if government increases tax rates in future, people have enough of their savings. There is no impact in future. There is no impact in the present also. Because if government increases borrowing levels, increases its fiscal deficit in the hope of pushing the economy, improving the aggregate demand levels, well, aggregate demand levels won't be pushed upwards. Why? Because people have also started saving. So they are spending less again. So you can either tax them and they have little money to spend, or you can not tax them and borrow. People will still have less money to spend. Why? Because they'll keep the other half in their savings. They won't increase their spending. So David Ricardo says it doesn't matter. Fiscal expansion doesn't matter. It doesn't matter in the present. It won't increase aggregate demand levels now. It won't increase. It won't have any impact in the future. This is known as Ricardian equivalence. Equivalence means it doesn't matter. Do anything you want. You can increase taxes to finance your spending. You can increase borrowings to finance your spending. It doesn't matter. This is what Ricardian equivalence proposition is. Now that you have explained Ricardian equivalence proposition, now the second part of the question is comment on its relevance in Indian context. Well, you see, Ricardian equivalence proposition is not a law. It doesn't work always. It works in certain conditions, but it doesn't always work. Sometimes David Ricardo's proposition does not work at all. As a matter of fact, many economists believe that it doesn't work at all. It only works in certain exceptional circumstances, right? And in India, this year's economic survey has proved that in India, REP doesn't work. Which means If government expands fiscally, aggregate demand levels would rise. Ricardian equivalence proposition doesn't work in Indian context. Ricardian equivalence proposition is a theoretical proposition and works in theory only. It doesn't work in practice. And even if it has to work in practice, it needs to follow certain conditions. Certain circumstances have to fall in place for this particular theory to come into practice. Right? In India's economy, economic survey, this year's economic survey actually gathered data. And they found that Ricardian equivalence proposition doesn't work in Indian context. Right? So comment on its relevance in the Indian context. The answer is that it doesn't work in the Indian context. But now you cannot write just one sentence. You'll have to write this particular point in detail. That how can we safely say that REP doesn't work in Indian context? Well, those words, those sentences, those phrases, you'll find them in your model answers. All right. And with that, we come to the end of our lecture today. I hope you liked this lecture and I hope it added some value to your preparation. Right? So yes, guys. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time with another set of 5 questions. Thank you.